Welcome to this session on women's place in different cultures. I'm your resource person, Dr. Grace Dawn Namjing. This particular topic is part of MA in Gandhi and Peace Studies, and the name of the course is Women and Peace, and course code is MGPE 012, which is an elective course, and this is Block 1, Unit 3. Before I begin with the introduction, this particular course will talk about the status, position of women in the society, and we will talk about the various status and position in different periods of time. We will first talk about the position and status of women in the Vedic period, which is the Rig Vedic period. Then we will move on to the status of women in the post-Vedic period, then the medieval period, and then we move on to the modern period, and also we will discuss the status and position of women in Hinduism, which will cover these periods, and also we will talk about women in Muslim society, we will talk about women in Buddhism as well as women in Christianity. When we talk about status of women, we will be talking about how the position of women were in these particular periods of time. Like, what is the status? How were women treated in these period of time? This is what we will be discussing today. The introduction for today's session would talk about the what of a civilization, which can be judged from the position that it gives to women, of the several factors that justify the greatness of India's ancient culture. One of the greatest is the honored place ascribed to women. So this is how we are going to start today's session. When we talk about the place of women's status and position in the society, the worth of a civilization can be judged from the position that it gives to women of the several factors that justify the greatness of India's ancient culture. One of the greatest is the honor place ascribed to women. Manu, the great lawgiver, said long ago in Manu Smriti, wherever women are given their due respect, even the deities like to reside there, and where they are not respected, all action remains unfruitful. So Manu also gives a very high status to women, saying that wherever women are given their due respect, even the deities like to reside there, and where they are not respected, all action remains unfruitful. So this is the respect that Manu gives to women. Then when we talk about women's place in different culture, we will first move to Rig Vedic period. First, we will talk about women in Hinduism. In women in Hinduism, we will talk about women in the Rig Vedic period, and we will talk about women in the post-Vedic period, and also women's position and status in these period. In the Rig Vedic period, there are numerous hymns in the Rig Veda indicating women were assigned a high place in the Vedic society. Women were also allowed to observe celibacy and study Vedas. Even the sacred thread ceremony, which is called the Upanaya Samskara, were being performed for women, and women also used to teach. So this was the place and status of women in Rig Vedic period. Then women in the Rig Vedic period also were not married till they were in their late teens, and sometimes even later. They also had a fair amount of choice in the selection of a mate, which is evidenced by the prevalence of the Swayamvara system. Swayamvara system is where a woman is allowed to select her mate. So when we talk about these instances, we see that women in the Rig Vedic period had a good status. They had a good position in the society in terms of they were allowed to teach, certain religious rites were performed for them, and then girls were not married early, and they had a fair amount of choice in the selection of a mate. Then when we move on to the post-Vedic period, which is the period after 300 BC, there was a lot of succession of invasions and influx of foreigners such as the Greeks, the Scythians, the Parthians, the Kushans and others. So The political misfortunes, the war atrocities followed by long spells of anarchy and lawlessness had a disastrous effect on the society, and there was a lot of fear and insecurity which haunted the common people and the householders. So because of these reasons, we have sons being valued higher than daughters because of the need for more fighting males in order to survive the waves of onslaughts. So it was also imperative to protect women from abductors. So what was felt was, the men in the society felt that it was necessary to curtail women's freedom and movements, and early marriage was perhaps employed as a part of those defensive measures, which means that if you marry your daughters early, then they will be safe from abductors. And also the education of the girl child was no longer a priority, because you want to marry your daughter early, so you do not give her education because you feel that because she is to get married early, so why give her education. So this were some of the instances of women in the post-Vedic period. And also remarriage of widows was stopped, and they were asked to devote themselves to an ascetic life at home. The shaving of head of the widow was enforced by about the 8th century AD, and the parda system was widely used in the middle class families. So this was when the remarriage of widows was stopped. Then we had the shaving of the head of the widow, which was enforced, and then the parda system, which was widely used in the middle class families. Women during medieval period. We had just discussed about women in the Vedic period, in the post-Vedic period. Let us now move on to women during the medieval period. During the 7th to the 9th century AD, this is the time when, this is the medieval period. It is during this time we find that the general level of the culture and position of women was high. Women, including those not belonging to higher classes, had some opportunities for liberal education as well as training in fine arts, especially those of painting, music, and so on. Remarriage of widows was stopped. They were asked to devote themselves to an ascetic life at home, and also the parda system was also widely practiced, and there was a marked deterioration of the status of women in the medieval period. In spite of women to some extent having a good position and status in the society, remarriage of widows was stopped, the parda system was widely used, and you have the status of women slowly declining, deteriorating in the medieval period. Then after the medieval period, we come to women in modern period. When we talk about the modern period, especially during the 19th and 20th centuries, the status of women was improved by the untiring efforts of the following social reformers, among others, like, let me take a few examples of the social reformers who really worked towards the upliftment of women, to uplift the position and status of women. We have social reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, we have Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, we have social reformers like Dayanand Saraswati as well as Keshav Chandra Sen. These were the social reformers who really worked hard to uplift the women status and position in the society. The important reason for the change in the social status of women in the modern period, especially in the 19th century, is the acceptance of the tenets of liberal philosophy from the Western civilization. And also, when we talk about this particular change of status in women, it is because you accept certain tenets of certain teachings of liberal philosophy from the Western civilization, and also it emphasizes the principle of contract, not the status, a rational outlook of life and its problems, freedom of speech, criticism of authenticity of dogmas, and insistence on the rights of man as opposed to his duties. And it was during this modern period, for the first time in India, social legislation was enacted by the government in 19th century. Sati was abolished. With Widow Remarriage Act of 1856, widow remarriage became legal. Then we have the establishment of Arya Samaj by Dayanand Saraswati, and this particular establishment of Arya Samaj condemned practices of several religions and communities, including such as practice of idol worship, animal sacrifices, offerings made in temples, child marriages, discrimination against women. And also we have the contribution of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who founded the Arya Samaj, and he has crusaded, he has worked against Hindu customs such as sati, polygamy, child marriage and the caste system, and also demanded property rights for women. So it was because of the hard work of these social reformers we have sati being abolished, widow remarriage becoming legal, establishment of Arya Samaj by Dayanand Saraswati, and also the crusade by Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who also set up the Brahmo Sabha, a movement of reformers, Bengali Brahmins, to fight against social evil. So these were the various contribution which was very valuable to uplift the status and position of women in the society. This was during the modern period, and also a very valuable contribution by the father of our nation. Gandhiji encouraged women to participate in the political movements. Gandhi's fundamental faith in the equality of women was based on non-violence. Women have much right to establish her own destiny as man has to establish his. So we have the father of our nation, Gandhiji, working towards the emancipation of women, to empower women by encouraging women to participate in all the political movements. We have famous freedom fighters like Sarojini Naidu, who took part in the political movement, and so many more. And it was because of this this encouragement of Gandhiji that we have a lot of women participating in the political movements. And also Gandhiji faith in equality of women, which was based on non-violence, saying that women have a right to establish her own destiny as man has to establish his. Now, after talking about women in Rig Vedic, post-Vedic, medieval as well as modern period, and also after talking about the contribution of Mahatma Gandhi, let us move on to the status of women in Muslim society. What is the status of women in Muslim society? What is the position of women in Muslim society? When we talk about women in Muslim society, the legal systems under which women live in Muslim countries are mostly dual systems, which means that on the one hand you have the civil law, which is indebted to Western legal systems, and on the other hand we have the family or personal status law, which is mainly built upon Sharia or Islamic religious based law. We have women in Muslim society are mainly ruled by what is called the personal laws, which is mainly built upon Sharia, Islamic religious based laws. So we have the personal laws according to which inheritance, according to which property rights and so on are based on these personal laws. The civil laws as well as the constitution of many Muslim states provide for equal rights between women and men. However, Islamic family law, as variously manifested in Muslim nation, poses obstacles to women's equality, because on one hand you have the civil law which is there in the country, but on the other hand women are ruled by what is called the personal law. So we have the rights and status of women, which is which is ruled by these personal laws, which poses obstacles to women's equality. So this is the status of women in Muslim society. Now let me move on to women in Christianity. What is the status of women in Christianity? When we talk about the status of women in Christianity, in Christian society, the status of women comes out strongest in the writings of Saint Paul. Who was Saint Paul? Saint Paul is the apostle of Jesus Christ. And when we say apostle means missionary, or apostle mean the follower of Jesus Christ. It means a follower who taught the tenets of Christianity. So Saint Paul was a very devoted follower of Jesus Christ, whose writings, in his writings, the status of women comes out strongest. And in his writings, the text clearly express the subordination of women. For century teaching is that women is the glory of man and other women are not allowed to speak in church, was taken as a scriptural justification of women's subjugation to man and the exclusion of women from liturgical activity in Christian churches. So in the various teachings, in the various testaments in the Bible, in the various writings of Saint Paul and other apostles, we have writings which clearly express the subordination of women, saying that women are is the glory of man. So women has to, if a woman's character is good, she brings glory to the glory of man, and women are not allowed to speak in the church. And then we have writings which talks about the exclusion of women from liturgical activity in Christian churches, which means that women are not allowed to speak in the church. Then married women stands at the bottom of a hierarchy, at the top of which is God. Christ and husband mediate in between, so that the woman seems further removed from Christ and from God than her husband. So we see this is the status and position of women as described in Christianity, especially from the writings of Saint Paul. Then let us move on to women in Jainism. When we talk about women in Jainism, it was during the Mahavira period, which was regarded best in the Jain community, which was regarded as best for the status of women. This is the period, the Mahavira period, which is regarded as the best for the status of women. And it was during this period, during this Mahavira period, a crucial revolt against the existing tradition, and he extended his solid support to uplift this very important but most neglected organ of the family, where they became least powerful and most disregarded and controlled bitterly by men in each and every sphere. So we have during this period regarded best in the Jain community for the status of women, who made then a crucial revolt against the existing tradition and extended his solid support to uplift the condition and status of women. And when Mahavira thought about the harsh attitude of men towards women and all these nefarious practices, he stood against these social evils and freed them from an indignation for their own progress in all works of life. So this was women in Jainism. Then we will be talking about women in Buddhism. We have already discussed the position and status of women in Christianity. In Jainism, we have looked at and discussed about the status of women in Hinduism. Let me move on to the status of women in Buddhism. There is not the slightest doubt that Buddha was the first religious teacher who gave women equal and unfettered opportunities in the field of spiritual development. Although he had pointed out on several occasions the natural tendencies and weaknesses of women, he had also given due credit to the abilities and capabilities. And according to what the Buddha taught about the law of karma, he said, one is responsible for one's action and its consequences. The well-being of a father or a grandfather does not depend upon the action of the son or grandson. They were responsible for their own actions. Such enlightened teachings helped to correct the views of many people and naturally reduce the anxiety of women who were unable to produce sons to perform the rites of the ancestors. So it was through this teaching of Buddha who talked about the law of karma, saying that one is responsible for one's action and its consequences. It freed a lot of women from anxiety. It freed a lot of women from the pressure of having sons, because a lot of women felt pressure to produce sons, because after all it was a patriarchal society. So this teaching of Buddha uplifted women and freed them from anxieties and helped and improve the status of women. So in today's session, when we talked about women's place in different cultures, we had talked about women in Hinduism, where we talked about women in the Vedic period, where we said the status of women was good. And we talked about how they were allowed to teach, and also certain ceremonies like the tying of the thread was performed for them. Then we moved on to what was the post-Vedic period, to the medieval period, where the status of women were slowly deteriorating, declining, and then we come to what is called the modern period because of the work of the various reformers. We had the condition and status of women which was improved, sati being abolished, widow remarriage being legalized, and then we moved on to the discussion on women in Muslim society, in Buddhism, Jainism, and in Christianity. So when we talk about the place of women in different cultures, we see that in mostly all culture, these different cultures, we have the status of and position of women in varying degree. We see that in some society the condition was good, the status was good. However, to a large extent, the status and position of women was not as good as the status of men, because at times they would not have what is called your inheritance right, they would not have what is called your property rights. So with this discussion on women's place in different cultures, we end this today's session. Thank you for listening.